Nairobi, the bustling capital of Kenya where parliament and the presidency stand as the supposed pillars of democracy. Yet today, the air over this city feels heavy, almost electric, as if a storm were gathering on the horizon. And this storm is unlike any Kenya has faced before, not between ruling and opposition parties, but between parliament itself and President William Ruto. It began with words that cracked through the nation like thunder. Cameras rolled as President Ruto stood before the country, accusing members of parliament of pocketing millions of shillings in bribes to pass laws. His promise was sharp, almost ruthless. We will arrest them. We will prosecute them. These weren't whispers in backrooms. They were declarations made in broad daylight, and they hit the heart of parliament like sparks on dry grass. Within hours, the backlash erupted. Bumula MP Jack Wamboka slammed his fist on the table, declaring he would not sit back while the president smeared the legislature. He vowed to file a motion of impeachment. In one dramatic stroke, the unimaginable became possible, parliament preparing to go to war against the presidency. Soon after, Speaker Moses Wetangula added fuel to the fire using a haunting metaphor. When a hyena wants to eat its children, it first accuses them of smelling like goats. To many, this was no riddle. It was a direct accusation that the president had betrayed his own allies to save himself. So the question now is, what is truly happening inside Kenya? Is this the beginning of a historic reckoning that could clean up corruption once and for all? Or is it a dangerous power play that might plunge the nation into deeper crisis ahead of the 2027 elections? And for ordinary Kenyans already weary from poverty, joblessness, and years of broken promises, who can they really trust? As we unpack this unfolding story, remember this: Kenya is not just a local drama. It is a mirror reflecting the struggle of many African nations, where the fight against corruption and the battle to regain public trust may determine the future of the continent itself. What do you think? Is Kenya moving closer to the truth or digging itself into a deeper hole? Stay with me until the end. And if you believe truth matters more than headlines, please subscribe so we can continue uncovering Africa's real story together. The storm broke in the most unlikely way, with a president turning his fury not on foreign powers, not on shadowy militias, but on the very lawmakers sworn to work beside him. In a nationally televised address, President William Ruto chose to tear the veil off Kenya's parliament. His words were not measured, they were cutting. He accused sitting members of parliament of accepting bribes, millions of Kenyan shillings, to pass laws that should have been debated on principle, not purchased like goods in a market. One example rang louder than the rest: the passage of Kenya's anti-money laundering law. According to Ruto, MPs had collected 10 million shillings from shadowy interests to ensure its approval. He asked the chamber directly, "Do you know that a few members of your committee collected 10 million shillings? Did you get the money? We will not shame them, we will arrest them." For ordinary Kenyans watching, it was electrifying. Here was their president unmasking the dirty underbelly of the legislative process. Many at home cheered. Finally, someone had the courage to speak aloud what everyone whispered in markets and bus stations: Parliament was for sale. But inside the chamber, his remarks landed like a hammer on glass. The silence was first stunned, then broken by anger. Bumula MP Jack Wamboka was the first to react. His voice rose, trembling with rage, as he declared that Ruto had bitten off more than he could chew. He vowed to bring an impeachment motion against the president, accusing him of smearing the entire legislature with one reckless statement. "We will now exercise our teeth," Wamboka thundered. "We will bite." The chamber erupted. Some MPs pounded their desks in support, others jeered, and still others sat in uneasy silence. The idea of impeaching a sitting president, once unthinkable, was suddenly on the table. The atmosphere in Nairobi shifted instantly. What began as a corruption scandal was transforming into a full-blown constitutional showdown. The day's drama did not end there. Within hours, Speaker of the National Assembly Moses Wetangula gathered a select group of lawmakers and whisked them to the coastal city of Mombasa for a closed-door retreat. The secrecy of the meeting, the timing, and the location sparked immediate speculation. What was said behind those doors would ripple far beyond the Indian Ocean coast. When Wetangula finally spoke, it was not in plain accusations, but in parable. He told his colleagues, "When a hyena wants to eat its children, it first accuses them of smelling like goats." The room fell silent. His meaning was unmistakable. The hyena was the president himself, accusing Parliament of corruption, only to destroy them, to scapegoat them, to cover his own vulnerabilities ahead of the next election cycle. That parable leaked out of the retreat like wildfire. Across Nairobi, radio stations replayed the line. Newspapers splashed it across their front pages. Social media buzzed with memes, drawings, and bitter jokes. The Speaker of Parliament had in effect declared that the President of Kenya was a predator willing to devour his own allies to stay alive politically. Meanwhile, in the streets, ordinary Kenyans listened and wondered what to believe. Many had long suspected their MPs of corruption. They had seen the sudden luxury cars, the sprawling estates, the campaign money flowing like water. But they also knew the president was no saint. Rumors had swirled for years that State House itself was the epicenter of political bribery. By the time the weekend arrived, Kenya had entered uncharted waters. On one side stood a president painting Parliament as a den of thieves. On the other, a Parliament ready to brand the president as a traitor and even launch impeachment. The gloves were off. And this was only the beginning. The spark of accusation had already lit the fire. But the true explosion came when Parliament turned its guns not just outward, but squarely back on the president. In the days that followed Ruto's fiery speech, the backlash built like a rising tide. MPs lined up to respond, and their words were no less venomous than the president's. What began as a defensive reaction soon became an open counterattack. One legislator after another accused Ruto of hypocrisy, claiming that he, not Parliament, was the prefect of corruption. It was a phrase that stuck. On live television, MP after MP challenged the president to look in the mirror. They pointed directly to State House, the very office of the presidency, as the temple of corruption. Kenyans know one MP declared that the true sanctuary of bribery is not Parliament, but State House itself. For many citizens, this claim cut deep. If true, then the rot was not at the periphery of power, it was at its heart. The accusations grew more detailed. George Quimburi, a fiery MP, stunned the chamber when he named names. He alleged that Ruto had personally funneled cash through Majority Leader Kimani Ichung'wah, who then distributed it among MPs to ensure the president's bills passed. Millions, he said, had changed hands under this system. The image was damning Ruto standing as anti-corruption crusader in public while orchestrating bribery behind closed doors. The chamber descended into chaos. Some MPs cheered Quimburi's boldness, others shouted him down. The speaker's gavel banged over and over again, but the noise refused to die. This was no longer a debate. It was an all-out brawl, political and moral. Outside Parliament, the nation reacted with disbelief and anger. Radio talk shows buzzed with callers, some defending the president, as finally exposing the rot, others insisting he was simply scapegoating to hide his own sins. Street vendors, taxi drivers, students, and church leaders all took sides. Some carried placards praising Ruto as a hero. Others mocked him as a hyena fattened on the very system he now condemned. The climax reached its peak when Jack Wamboka officially tabled his impeachment motion. Cameras captured the moment as he held up the papers, his face stern and unflinching. The president has overstepped. He has dishonored this House. And for that, we must act. Gasps filled the chamber. The unimaginable was now real. The president of Kenya could be put on trial by his own parliament. Ruto's allies, meanwhile, dug in. Cabinet Secretary Opio, one of his most vocal defenders, dared Parliament to bring it on. If they want war, he said, we will give them war. His defiance only hardened the lines. Supporters rallied around Ruto, accusing Parliament of trying to protect its corrupt networks. International observers began to take notice. Diplomats quietly warned that Kenya's stability, a cornerstone of U.S. and European security interests in East Africa, was under threat. Markets trembled. The Kenyan shilling slipped. Investors worried about paralysis at the top of government. The world had seen political storms in Kenya before, but this one was unique, not a clash between parties, but a civil war within the state itself. In the churches of Nairobi, sermons turned to morality and leadership. Priests and pastors invoked scripture warning against leaders who cast stones while living in glass houses. In the markets of Mombasa, traders whispered, "If both the president and parliament are corrupt, who will save us?" That question hung in the air heavier than any law or policy. And yet for Ruto, retreat was impossible. To step back would be to admit weakness. For parliament, silence was equally unthinkable. To remain quiet would be to accept humiliation. Both sides had crossed the Rubicon. The climax had arrived. Kenya was no longer asking if a confrontation would happen. The nation was bracing for when. As the shouting in Parliament echoed across Nairobi, the shockwaves spread into the streets. For ordinary Kenyans, this was not just a quarrel of elites, it was a confrontation that reached directly into their daily lives, into the fragile trust that bound them to the state. The first consequence was public disillusionment. Citizens who had hoped for reform now felt trapped between two wolves fighting over the same prey. On one side, a president portraying himself as a crusader against corruption. On the other, legislators insisting he was the very architect of bribery. For the Kenyan worker earning just a few hundred shillings a day, it sounded like the same story on repeat, leaders accusing one another while the cost of food transport and medicine continued to rise. Protests began to stir. In Nairobi's Mathare slum, young people gathered at street corners debating whether impeachment would solve anything. In Eldoret, the president's hometown loyalists rallied, vowing that no parliament could topple their leader. Police patrols grew heavier around Parliament and State House, their sirens cutting through the night like warnings of an approaching storm. The second consequence was political paralysis. With Parliament consumed by impeachment talk, legislative business stalled. Bills on healthcare, education funding, and infrastructure were left in limbo. Committees stopped functioning as every meeting dissolved into arguments about corruption and loyalty. Kenya's fragile democracy seemed to grind to a halt, not because of external enemies, but because its two highest institutions were locked in open warfare. International investors noticed. The Kenyan shilling lost value against the dollar, and rumors spread of capital flight. For a country heavily dependent on foreign loans, and trade instability at the top meant instability everywhere. Families waiting for new jobs in planned infrastructure projects saw their hopes fade as tenders froze. University students waiting for scholarships heard nothing but silence. The third consequence was erosion of institutional credibility. The judiciary, long accused of weakness, now found itself under pressure. Citizens asked, would the courts dare intervene if the impeachment motion advanced? Could the judiciary arbitrate fairly between a parliament and a president both accused of corruption? For many Kenyans, the answer was already bleak. Trust in all three arms of government, the presidency, parliament, and judiciary, was sinking fast. And then came the whispers about 2027. Every political move was now interpreted through the lens of the next election. Was Ruto attacking parliament to position himself as a reformer, cleansing the system ahead of his campaign? Were MPs striking back to weaken him before he consolidated too much power? Analysts warned that impeachment, even if unsuccessful, would scar the nation and polarize it further along ethnic and regional fault lines that Kenya has never fully healed since the violence of 2007. For ordinary families, the drama carried a more immediate cost fear. Fear that jobs would vanish, that violence might return, that Kenya's reputation as East Africa's most stable democracy was slipping away. Mothers whispered about stocking extra flour and cooking oil just in case. Fathers muttered about whether to send their children to school or keep them home if protests turned violent. The national mood was one of waiting, watching, bracing. And so the civil and political consequences of this clash began to crystallize. Kenya was not simply witnessing a battle of words between its president and parliament. It was standing at the edge of a deeper crisis, one that threatened to erode public trust, stall economic progress, and fracture the very institutions meant to protect its democracy. The storm had moved beyond the chamber. Now it was consuming the nation. As Kenya's institutions squared off in a battle of survival, the world was not watching passively. This confrontation between the presidency and parliament carried consequences far beyond Nairobi's city limits. For Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and even Moscow, the clash raised unsettling questions about stability in one of East Africa's anchor states. The United States has long viewed Kenya as a strategic partner. Nairobi hosts regional command centers for counterterrorism operations against al-Shabaab in Somalia. U.S. aid programs, from health initiatives to food security, pour millions into Kenyan communities each year. To American eyes, Kenya represents not just a trading partner, but a crucial security buffer in a volatile region. And so, the sight of its president and parliament accusing each other of systemic corruption alarmed policymakers in Washington. American diplomats began to signal caution. If Ruto's impeachment fight spiraled out of control, U.S. counterterrorism efforts could be compromised. Aid disbursement might be disrupted. Even worse, Kenya's image as a model democracy in Africa, one that successive U.S. administrations have proudly held up, could collapse. Quietly, officials in the State Department worried if Kenya unravels who fills the vacuum, China, Russia, Europe too watched nervously. The European Union has invested heavily in Kenya's renewable energy sector and agricultural exports. Instability in Nairobi could ripple into disrupted trade routes, supply chain uncertainty, and new refugee flows across East Africa. Brussels faces enough strain from migration crises elsewhere. A destabilized Kenya could add a dangerous new layer. Meanwhile, Beijing played its cards differently. China has poured billions into Kenya's infrastructure, railways, highways, and ports under its Belt and Road Initiative. For Chinese investors, political risk is not an abstraction. It is a threat to loans and contracts already on the ground. Yet, unlike the US, China does not lecture about democracy. For Beijing, the question was pragmatic. Can Ruto guarantee stability long enough to keep Chinese projects safe? If not, does Parliament hold the key to safeguarding Chinese interests? Russia, for its part, seized the moment to amplify its narrative. Western-backed democracies are inherently fragile. State media outlets framed Kenya's turmoil as another sign that the Western model fails in Africa. Moscow whispered offers of deeper security cooperation, hoping that disillusioned leaders might look northward for alternatives. But perhaps the most important reaction came from Africa itself. Leaders across the continent were reminded of their own fragile balances of power. Some sympathized with Ruto's attempt to call out corruption. Others privately warned that he had broken a cardinal rule: never attack the legislature so directly lest it fight back. In West Africa, comparisons were drawn to Burkina Faso, where Captain Ibrahim Traoré had rejected Western-style democratic institutions altogether in favor of sovereignty-driven reforms. To many African observers, Kenya's crisis was proof of a deeper truth: institutions imported from colonial systems may no longer hold the continent together. For American audiences, the question lingers: should Washington continue betting on fragile partners who speak the language of democracy but stumble under its weight? Or should it prepare for a continent reshaping itself, sometimes through turbulence, sometimes through bold leadership, like that of Traore in Burkina Faso? One thing is certain: what happens in Nairobi will not stay in Nairobi. It will ripple across Africa, and the world will be forced to reckon with the outcome. Kenya now stands at a crossroads. What began as a bold accusation from the president has spiraled into a constitutional showdown, shaking the very foundations of the nation's democracy. Parliament threatens impeachment. The president doubles down. And the people caught between dueling accusations of corruption are left to wonder if anyone in power truly serves them. The warning signs are clear. A country once celebrated as a regional model risks sliding into paralysis and mistrust. When the presidency and parliament both lose credibility, the vacuum they create invites instability, unrest, and manipulation from abroad. History teaches us that when institutions fail, it is always the ordinary citizen who pays the price in jobs lost in schools, unfunded in hospitals without medicine. Kenya cannot afford to let its leaders drag the entire nation into the abyss of political survival games. But this is not only Kenya's story. Across Africa, nations wrestle with the same demons: corruption, foreign dependency, and fragile democratic systems that often serve elites more than citizens. It is here that comparisons arise. In West Africa, Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré has chosen a different controversial path, rejecting external dictates, dismantling institutions seen as compromised, and calling for sovereignty built from the ground up. Whether one agrees with Traoré or not, his model forces a sobering question: is Africa better served by clinging to systems imposed from the outside, or by daring to build something entirely new? For Americans watching, the Kenyan crisis is more than a distant headline. It raises questions about where U.S. alliances stand, how aid is spent, and whether Washington is prepared for an Africa charting its own course, even when that path does not fit the Western mold. If Kenya falters, it will test not only Africa's resilience, but also America's willingness to adapt to a changing world. So I leave you with this: is Kenya's turmoil simply a domestic quarrel, or is it a sign of a continental awakening, one that demands new models of leadership and accountability? Can we continue to trust leaders who point fingers while their own hands are stained? Or should Africa look to figures like Traoré, who promise to rewrite the rules altogether? Share your thoughts below. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's reform strategies are the way forward for Africa, or should nations like Kenya find their own path? Please comment. Let us know where you stand. And if you believe the truth matters more than headlines, subscribe to this channel because together we can uncover the deeper stories shaping Africa's future.